Last week we started the first of 4 sermons, and you may remember that I talked about the journey that was forced upon, because no one volunteers for this kind of journey, a spiritual hero of mine, then a Baptist pastor in Louisville, Kentucky. And he preached 4 different sermons as he walked through that journey. He probably preached many more. It was only in those 4 sermons that he explicitly walked through that experience. And last week we talked about the danger of coming to quick conclusions. We talked about the fact that cliches come easy, but God's ways cannot be summed up in any kind of simplistic answers that we come up with. And so today we're going to visit this passage that I've visited before. As I said, it is one of my favorite passages. It has, until recently, a calligraphy has hung on the wall of my office, reminding me of this daily. So as I did last week, I began with a journal piece that was read before Claypool's second sermon. We had 9 months of almost total normalcy, except for taking medication every day and having blood check once a month. Laura Lou's life was much as it had been. She made good progress in the 3rd grade, continued her study of violin and ballet, and all kinds of hopes were born in us during those days. Had she been healed? Were the doctors mistaken in their original diagnosis? We hoped so. But ironically, early Easter Sunday morning, she awoke in severe pain. Her eyes began to swell. She hurt all over. And by Monday, we were back in Children's Hospital in an acute relapse. Her body had gradually built up an immunity to the medicine that had been helping, and it was no longer effective in holding the disease in check. After 10 days of agonizing suffering, the new medicine did take effect, and Laura Lou moved into a second period of remission. The words that follow grew out of a difficult experience of relapse. The first one's when people get off from work on Friday afternoon and they're all up to party. Heaven's Jubilee. And the last is the last call, when people are sitting around kind of, trying to figure out what they're going to do after they have to go home. It is a sad song. It is a sad thought. But then again, the journey that people walk through as they're trying to find ways to say goodbye to those whom they love, that's a hard journey. And people do ask questions. Now, I got to say, probably because he was, a spiritual hero of mine, that John Claypool had no interest in exploiting the death of his daughter. But here's what happens when you pastor a church, and I made a little footnote of this last week, that when you're experiencing life in the hard places, people want to know. And what they really want to know is your faith making a difference in this journey? And so the questions came, not just from within, but they came from members of the congregation. What is it? What does that feel like? I can't imagine. But what they were really saying is, I'm not really sure that my faith would make a difference if it was my daughter whose life was imperiled. Firstly, I think when we begin processing out the journey, when it comes to expectation, folk are often victimized by how others make promises in the name of God. My sister in North Carolina is going through a really hard time. Grief is hard enough. You know that. Many of you have walked that journey. grief is hard enough, but about every other day, I'm having a conversation with her. I try to find, times when there might be some quiet in the household, though she's got so many animals running around. I'm not sure there's ever any quiet. And what is happening is, in terms of her experience, it's the same thing that many of you have also experienced. People trying to fix the grief. People offering inane sayings, thinking that they can make this feel better. At least down south, people would bring you a pumpkin pie while you were grieving. Not that you actually needed it. That incessant need to relieve you of your discomfort, because your discomfort makes us feel uncomfortable. Your grief reminds us of loss that we've had in our own life. And so they go around, we sometimes have gone around, and we build expectations about the help that comes from God. And it's not helpful, and it's presumptuous, and we don't speak for God in those situations. When those expectations go unmet, it gets so hard. C.S. Lewis came to faith very late in life, relatively late in life. He married a woman, Joy Davidson, who also came to faith rather late in life. They married. He became a kind of apologist, if you will, for the Christian faith. And many people have found his writings exquisite. I have found him most interesting because I don't know how many times I've had to read his children's books, the Chronicles of Narnia, to my children as they've grown up. Joy developed cancer, and they had only 3 years together. It became really hard initially for him to understand how that can happen. Why in the world would God do this kind of thing? But what Lewis later wrote as he walked through that process, and he talked about his disappointment that came, he said that he failed because he had his own expectations of what God might do, ought to do, could do. That he failed to see the moments of grace. Grace, I'm throwing in there because I love that expression. The moments of grace, the moments of God's work that had taken place as he walked through that journey. That's what happens. We build ourselves up expecting something, and because the expectations are unreal or have no ground, then we become disillusioned that God hasn't shown up when we needed God to show up the most. Today's reading from Isaiah, you've heard me in memorial services lift this up because I just find it incredibly powerful. Because in this image from this prophet trying to address people who were incredibly disillusioned that the Babylonians showed up and God didn't, in their eyes, in their minds, here the prophet was trying to find a way to give expression for the people to hear. And in this sermon, if you will, he finds just the right prose that might help the people hear. And in that prose, there's like 3 different ways that God can be experienced in journey. The first is ecstatic. Now, here's what I wish. I wish I could live my life and God would just kind of give me day after day ecstatic experiences. What that would mean is, of course, that when I met you throughout the week, that you'd only have good news to tell me. It would mean that you never said anything bad about my sermons or me or anything else. What that would look like is that we would all do incredibly well in life and everything would be fine. And wow, let's have a party today because it's time to party and celebrate all this good stuff happening. This sense of ecstasy, which also, by the way, becomes problematic because growing up, I had friends who were part of the full gospel movement. And it seemed in terms of validation of their spiritual gifts, if they didn't have some ecstatic experience with God all the time, then something was wrong in their lives. God must have something against them. It is not possible to experience ecstasy all the time. Oh, but those moments. I could just see. I love to watch the osprey here. There's so many. When I used to fish down on Broad Creek in Delaware, there was this big old buoy marker up this little creek. And as we came up and the osprey was on the nest, the osprey would set sail, swooping across the water, trying to lead us, astray. Well, we didn't care about the osprey. We were going upstream to fish. But of course, it didn't know that. But the power of watching them dive and to get the catch. And then it's almost as if they're just like a propulsion mechanism into the heavens. Beautiful, beautiful. I remember ecstatic moments, many, many of them. I remember standing in a chancel in Dover, Delaware. And I'd felt in days prior to that pretty ragged. I'd been through some hard places, about 4 years of grind. I felt at some days as if I had absolutely just was finished. But that day, surrounded by friends and colleagues, 2 standing facing me, another by my side, Chris in the minority standing next to me, and we stood there, and I had incredible ecstasy that I had met the woman with whom I wanted to spend the rest of my life. See, I'm trying to make up for all those other times I use her name in vain. It was. And the congregation was amazing because there were people in the church who had walked with me in the 3 years prior to that when my first spouse had been away at school. And they'd walk with me through the days of divorce. There were people in the recovering community everywhere because I'd helped form a halfway house in the community and help pretty much raise the down payment to buy it. So they were everywhere. The church was almost a 24-hour recovery place in itself. There were people from Habitat for Humanity because after all, we'd met on the founding board for Central Delaware, Habitat for Humanity. All these people from all kinds of backgrounds, some of them who had no really religious interest at all, but here they were, celebrating my ecstasy. Chris may not have felt as good about it as I did, but I was having a really good day. Isn't that amazing how you can have those experiences? I can remember others, people that we ordained in Dallas who had no other avenue to be ordained because doors were closed at that time almost by every denomination. And those ordinations were powerful as people were being blessed that they could go forth and celebrate their gifts of ministry. But that's not how it happens all the time. We couldn't do that. The human beings are not made with that capacity. So, sometimes it's a different kind of help we get from God. Sometimes it's the daily sense of what Claypool called activism, the running and not being weary. I was younger once upon a time, and I was into my bicycling period. And I'd get home after working a full day, make sure that the kids were good, home from school, everything well, and I'd get on my bicycle and I would head west out from Dover, riding out amongst the Amish farms. It didn't matter that I worked today. I pedaled and I felt energy like you couldn't believe. In the spring and the summer, there were the green fields, the beautiful green fields and the farms. In the fall, the farms were pretty neat, and the Amish were about the only people left in America to actually put together corn shocks. I had a sentimental thing about that because in first grade, we'd draw Halloween pictures with corn shocks and pumpkins like Charlie Brown's special or something. It was wonderful to experience the air blowing in my face. Everything that happened during the day had been lifted, the energy that just came in such wonderful ways. And I gave thanks to God for that. But I remember the day my dad died. We knew it was going to happen. I had just been up there, and we came back, and then the staph infection had kicked in, and so the family had a conference on the phone conference, and we made a decision to turn the ventilator off. I knew it was going to happen the next morning. I was just simply waiting for the call, and when my sister called, I got out and had to walk and walk and walk. And I walked in the rain, and I was soaked and cold. There was no running and not being weary. That's not how life is. And I have used the metaphor for some people because after my dad died and then right after my sister died, I felt that there were these long periods of time, and the only way I could describe it is I was in this massive jar walking through molasses. That it took just incredible energy and everything was in slow motion. And yet, I couldn't run and not be weary, but I was moving through the grief process. Third promise, well, that's the most precious. You've heard me refer to that. It's the one we count on to survive. Joseph Piper once wrote that there were two classic forms of temptations, presumptuousness and despair. We feel most angry when we presume upon God. We can feel, because we presume upon God, incredibly in despair. If you could hear me pray, and thank God you can't, you just hear me pray here. I try to get paid to be pretty in here, all right? But if you could hear my prayer life out in the woods somewhere in the palm hammocks, it's a rough conversation. I let go with everything. Everything that's wrong. Everything I could do better than God. Things that I would fix, and I don't know why God doesn't fix them. And I go off and I go on. And by the way, if you're kind of appalled by that, it really means that you need to spend more time reading in the Hebrew Scriptures, because you would know the power of lament from some of the Psalms and even some of the other prophets. And after all, isn't that where Jesus got that powerful verse, my God, why have you abandoned me?" from the 22nd Psalm? Our prayer life is not about being sweet and pietistic. It's about trusting that God can receive everything that's within us. Because after all, God's the adult in the room. And yet, even as I feel those moments of despair, I grab hold. Because there's the expression, isn't it? To walk and not faint. Some days I can't soar. I can't run or bicycle or hike. Some days I roll out of bed and stumble to the bathroom and get my face washed and try to look better than I am so that I can drive down A1A without cursing too much and then be here when I open my Mary Oliver poems and try to find the strength I need to walk that day. How many of you, when you wondered where God was, somehow, some way, you felt the presence of God in such a way that you were able to simply walk or stumble and get through another day. That sometimes is the power of God. That sometimes is what the Spirit gives and we cling to if we're wise. And then in that moment, at the end of the day, we whisper, "Thank you." That's what we need in our lives to get through the hard places.